Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I am not Curtis Chang. I'm founding friend David French. Curtis couldn't join us this week, but I was going to be with y'all talking to our guest anyway. So it's just going to be the two of us. It's me and Michael Graham, co-author of a book with a really relevant and vivid title, The Great Dechurching. Who's leaving? Why are they going? And what will it take to bring them back? And Michael, you were co-authored this with Jim Davis, and it also says with Ryan Burge. So it's you and Jim with Ryan. And Ryan, I know good faith listeners, loyal good faith listeners will remember him because we've talked about him a million times and his research a million times. So Michael, welcome to the podcast. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
It's so good to be here. I've been really looking forward to this one.
All right. So the Great Dechurching, you are taking a look at something that I think when historians look back at this time period, will say this is one of the single most significant and rapid cultural changes in the country and really kind of in the nation's history. This extraordinary decrease in church affiliation. So first, sort of talk about what you did. There's an obvious reason for the book to take a look at it. What's going on? So how did you do this? What all did you look at?
Well, before I answer that, I don't want to bury the lead. And the lead is this. We're talking about 40 million adult Americans who have left houses of worship. That's all religious traditions in the last 25 to 30 years. And so that's the largest and fastest religious shift in our country's history. It's larger than the first and second Great Awakening, plus the entirety of the Billy Graham Crusades combined. So we got here. So Jim and I are both pastors in Orlando, Florida. I guess recently, now I'm the program director for the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics. So I guess my pastor hat's a little bit on the sidelines right now. Jim and I we had run across some data that 43% of our city had used to go to church, but now didn't. And we came across that data about 5 years ago. And so that generated a lot of conversation between ourselves and our elders of, okay, well, what does this mean? This is the second largest demographic in our city behind gender. And so, who are all these people? Why did they leave? And so we went on a kind of a journey to try and to read all the research that was there. And there was a little bit of data that was there, but it was old. It wasn't comprehensive enough. It wasn't granular enough. And it certainly wasn't actionable for the kinds of questions that we had from a missiological standpoint. And so that led us down a path to basically getting in touch with Ryan Burge. So Ryan wrote the book with us. Ryan is a social scientist, and his specialization is in quantitative analysis, basically religion data in the U.S. This is an opinion, but I think Ryan's the best religion data person in the country, and so that's why we contacted him. And his Substack is a must subscribe. The website's graphsaboutreligion.com. You can subscribe to his newsletter there. He publishes every Monday and every Thursday, and they're always must reads. Fascinating stuff. So we got with Ryan. And we just pitched Ryan on the idea of, hey, if we go and found a boatload of money to do a bunch of unique research that hasn't been done on the subject of these people who used to go to houses of worship, would you be interested in doing the data analysis for it? And he said yes. And so but he's like, it's going to cost you a lot of money to religion data is really expensive.
Yeah.
In the third phase of our study, so we did 3 phases in total, 7,000 respondents. And the first phase was basically how large is the problem. The second phase is a little bit more granular in looking at just people who had dechurched from all religious traditions. And in the third phase, we really zoomed in deeply on people who left evangelical churches. And so in that third phase of the study, we had over 600 data points per respondent in that third study. So we know a lot about people who left evangelical churches. So those surveys are expensive. That third phase was $14 a head. So you can do the math.
Goodness gracious.
That's why these studies don't really tend to happen. Is because they're very cost prohibitive, and people don't write books on these things because, unless you go and get a grant or whatever for that, it's there's just no money in it from a publication standpoint. So, so that's kind of the backstory of, how, because Orlando as a city where I live and, had pastored for nearly 15 years, we were the same percentage evangelical as Seattle and New York City. So we thought that was curious because, well, why? And we didn't know this, at that time, but, we're the least Bible-minded, least churched, pretty much every category that you can kind of slice it. We're the most secular of all cities in the Southeast,
Orlando.
including Atlanta and Miami. So
and I have been to some mega churches in Orlando.
Well, and that's the paradox, right? Because Orlando is this parachurch and megachurch mecca, but yet we're, from a spiritual standpoint, when you zoom out and look at the data, the situation is actually really bad here. And so we wanted to know, well, but why does Orlando feel different than Seattle or New York City from a cultural standpoint? And our kind of hunch on that was basically, we're dealing with a city that's dechurched, whereas Seattle and New York City are more unchurched contexts. Unchurched being a technical term for people who have never consistently gone to church. Dechurched being a technical term that we defined as somebody who went to church consistently at least once a month or more, and now goes less than once per year. So there's 40 million people that adult Americans, that used to go to church at least once per month, but now less than once per year. So just to put kind of pin the tail on the donkey here, we could have probably had even worse numbers, to cite if we had said like, oh, Christmas and Easter only people. Okay, we're going to count you as being dechurched as well. If you go to church every Christmas, well, we didn't count you. You're not in that 40 million. So there's probably several million, maybe even tens of millions of people that are underchurched, that we could probably, talk about as well. But we didn't. We want to draw the line in some pretty clear spots of like, you're clearly in or you're clearly out. So,
yeah. So let's take a short little detour, because I want to talk about some of the difficulties in getting data and getting good data on religious attendance and affiliation. And that is, how can we sort of control for, and I'm forgetting the exact term of art, but for when someone tells a pollster what they think the pollster wants to hear. In other words, one of my consistent theses or ideas is that all of these church attendance numbers, especially the more frequent numbers like weekly or whatever, are a little bit inflated, because people who kind of maybe want to be the kind of person who goes to church a lot will tell a pollster, yeah, I'm there all the time, when the reality is it might be substantially less. So how difficult is it to sort of really gauge this?
Yeah, I do think sometimes people can be aspirational in their, responses. They might say, yeah, I'm a weekly or weekly plus person, where that really means like 3 times a month or whatever. So, yeah, I mean, but there are studies out there that aren't dechurching specific, that do get some granularity on, once a week, twice a week, 3 times a week, 4 times a month versus multiple times per week. There do seem to be differences in terms of when you zoom in on those kinds of studies to see, oh yeah, like certain things tend to erode over time, as you go like less frequent, and certain trends seem to be more common, with higher frequency. So, I mean, I think that you have to, that's why we went with monthly plus, as opposed to doing anything more granular than that, because our sense is that there's probably not massive differences between, twice a month versus, 4 times a month in terms of, I mean, there's going to be differences on certain things and certain policy matters and those different kinds of things. But yes, I mean, but I think, from when you zoom out, the aspirational differences on some of those things probably are within the realm of, a standard deviation or two in terms of how you think about the underlying principles involved.
Right. So if somebody is saying, well, I go to church every week, but they really go twice a month, they're not dechurched.
Correct.
Yeah, they may not be there every week. They may not be as churched as they're saying, but they're not dechurched. So, okay. So, one thing that if you sort of follow the dechurching battles online, if your information about dechurching is gained, God help you, from Twitter, you might have one view as to why dechurching happens. And it's probably almost entirely related to scandals or controversies in the church, that somebody was affirmatively alienated from church by the conduct of people in the congregation. But that's, wow, that happens. That's not your main finding, is it?
So I think going into this, there were two prevailing stories. And the story that you got was probably dependent on what direction your information diet leaned. So if you had an information diet that leaned just left in any direction, slightly or even, strongly, yes, that would have been the story of, scandal within the church, church's own goals, racism, misogyny, clergy abuse, sexual abuse, political syncretism, white Christian nationalism. All of those things would have been kind of the prevailing story of, hey, this is what's going on. And certainly those things are, those are all things that are there. They're all evident.
Right.
And then if you were in an information diet ecosystem that leaned a little bit to the right, then the story there would have been, well, lots of people are leaving the church because they're not actually Christians. And the primary reason is because of basically progressivism, the secular left, and if you drill down, they might talk about the sexual revolution and these kinds of things. So those would have been the story in one direction versus the story in the other direction. And both stories do have, they're not totally false.
Right.
Just the question is really just a question of proportionality and completeness. So both stories were incomplete. So the story that we found is one that's far more boring than either of those really interesting stories.
Which is, by the way, then far more human too, right? I mean, we like to think of ourselves as sort of actors in this extraordinarily dramatic play. And then the reality is often super mundane stuff dominates our life. But anyway, go ahead.
So basically the big story is a story of just boring American rhythms. It just looks like that most of the people who left, probably 30 of the 40 million people, we call it left casually. Think unintentionally. Think just kind of floating on. The inertia of, life and its rhythms and your habits and your wants and desires just had you just kind of moving on from regular church attendance. It wasn't necessarily that you had a huge pain point or significant animus, or you even left with a high degree of intentionality. It's just, you just kind of floated on casually. The top reason why people dechurched was they moved. Number 2 was attendance was inconvenient. And number 3 was some form of family change. So divorce, remarriage, some other kind of family, baby, some other kind of family change. So, I would characterize most of those things as being, very casual in nature. Now, once you start drilling down, further down the list, you can start to see things where there's pain. Okay.
Yeah.
And I definitely don't want anybody hearing me minimizing the 10 million people who definitely seem to leave with some sort of significant pain point or pain points.
which is a lot of people. It
is a ton of people.
It's a ton of people. Yeah.
That's like more than the number of people in every NFL stadium, on any given Sunday.
Oh, for sure.
It's probably greater than the college football total census on any Sunday or any Saturday. But yeah, I mean, it's an incredible number of people. So the issues there tended to be relational on the individual level, institutional at the church level, both of those things at the same time. So there could have been relational friction or institutional friction or both on those things. So somebody could have had, any permutation and combination of individual versus institutional on animating issues like politics, race, misogyny, ethics of all sorts, particularly things surrounding sexuality and the use of power and the ways in which vulnerable people are treated. Those would be some of the kind of top animating things there of that.
Yeah, it's not like the church can say, aha, only 10 million people left because they were essentially, felt that they were chased out or were mistreated or abused. That's a terrible number, but it is not the majority in this huge body of people. So let's talk about sort of both groups, and let's start with the casuals. What it sounds like to me, sort of the casual leaving, when I say casuals, the casual leavers, what it sounds like to me, Michael, is that if there is a disruption in a habit or pattern of life, in other words, you move and you don't have that habit of a particular church, or there's a disruption with, say, a family dissolution, or maybe even, and perhaps we could talk about this, things like travel sports when your kids get older. It seems to me as if a lot of this is simply when something happens that breaks a habit, that then the habit, it is hard to restore it. Does it get kind of that simple?
I really do think that in terms of all the things that we could look at, that is the single most important factor, is basically it comes down to habits and rhythms.
Mm-hmm.
I think
fascinating.
Related to that would probably also be one's information diet. So this is a term I use to just kind of describe the sum total of media that you consume across multiple mediums. So anything you scroll, anything you listen to, anything you watch, basically the sum total of all input to your eyes and ears.
Yeah.
So I think that has a significant factor in terms of, what's forming and shaping you. It's really no different, David, than what my mom used to tell me, growing up as a kid, as a warning of like, Michael, garbage in, garbage out.
Right.
And I think that's, it's true today. And, I mean, we can look at horseshoes of all sorts, where, it's kind of garbage in and garbage out. And the challenge of our moment as we want to form and shape people into virtuous people. And you have to, if you want to change somebody's to become more virtuous, well, it's just a matter of inputs and outputs. So their calendar needs to look different if they need to look different, and their information diet needs to change. Otherwise, anything else is we're just awash, in an ocean of things that are just going to toss us in any which direction our information diet is already leans.
Right. So on the habit breaking aspect, it strikes me that this is a really challenging problem to address, because if you have one habit that is replaced by another habit, it then becomes difficult to come in and unwind all the new habit. So let me just stick with one example again, one that I'm very familiar with because of raising kids who are also athletes. high school athletes, not college athletes, but you all of a sudden at around a certain age, you start to have a series of quandaries. If your kids are, for example, in high school athletics, and you might say, well, no, it's not actually a quandary, David. You just go to church, right? But I have seen a lot of families say, for this season, we're going to have to miss some, right? And then when the season for this season of life, in addition to this athletic season, we're just going to miss some. But then before you know it, you're in a new habit, and you have this sensation where, okay, well, we've been on the road 2 straight weekends for volleyball. Now we have an opportunity to go to church, but by golly, we're just tired. Like, we've just been going. And the last thing I want to do is go somewhere else. And that strikes me as a really hard thing to, a really hard new pattern to break, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, this is where I'm going to sound more right wing.
Oh, just sound however you want to sound. Like, this is free flowing conversation. Yeah.
At the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves, what are humans, and what are we for? And these are going to be things that my children are 5 and 6, and my daughter's extremely athletic. I mean, she's just destroying it, and pretty much everything that she's doing. But what are humans? What are we for?
Yeah.
Why do we exist? And I think so much of the human life is getting our loves ordered correctly.
Yeah.
And we can get in so much trouble when our loves become disordered. And when I think about idols, that we have in our life, they're typically not necessarily intrinsically bad things. It's just when our love of something that's probably has a lot of inherent good gets out of whack to the range of tolerance of, what's a good range for how much affection we should have from our whole person in those things. So, I think for most people, like the travel sports thing, it probably shouldn't be a conversation. It should be a non-negotiable to be in church, unless there's some extremely compelling reason, some like D1, for sure thing. And, and with intentionality in terms of like, listen, you got to sit the family down and have a conversation, family, look, this thing over here is more important than this other thing over here. And if we're going to do something, we're making a commitment as a whole, as a whole household, that this is temporary. And on this date, this particular habit stops, and we go back to, that other pattern. I mean, I could go even more hardcore than that. And, I could go the route of, I could think of edge cases, but it's like, I don't think it's good to make policies around edge cases, just in general, pastorally, politically, policy, whatever. I mean, if Eric Little was here, from, Chariots of Fire, he'd tell us, we're pagan for even having this conversation.
Well,
and he might not be wrong.
Well, it's interesting because the reason I bring it up is that, and one of the things that I talk about frequently is we often actually don't know our hierarchies until they come into tension with each other.
Yeah.
So what we envision for ourselves. So if you said, I know people that if you said when their kids are in 4th grade, when it comes to youth sports or church, which one are you going to choose? And then when their kids are in 3rd or 4th grade and youth sports aren't an issue, they're going, I'm choosing church. I'm absolutely choosing church. And then it comes to be like they're in 8th grade or 9th grade, and the coach is saying every kid to be on the high school team has to do travel, whatever, then I see it happen all the time. They say, okay, just for this time period, just for a short period of time, we're going to try to accommodate both as much as possible. And then the next thing you know, they're accommodating one and not the other. And this, I think that, this is a consistent theme I have noticed in people who sort of, in my anecdotal experience of people kind of falling away, it's not that 5 years ago, 10 years ago, they would say, I value sports more than going to church, or if I move, of course, I'm going to find a church right away. Or, they would say that, but then when the event occurs and the tension actually arises between going to church and whatever other option is out there, that's when you understand where the hierarchy actually is. And that's why I say it gets difficult then, right? Because you're having to go back in essence, reorder people's hierarchies of priority. And that's what's difficult to me, not because if they're willing to say, well, for travel volleyball, I'm jettisoning church, then there's going to be a bunch of other stuff that will arise over the course of their life that they would jettison for it as well. So I guess that's what I'm getting at about the difficulty here.
Yeah, church is more competing with sleeping, streaming, scrolling, and sports than it is with controversy, and not to minimize again the controversy that's there.
Yeah, and I guess so. I'm 100% with you that, look, I mean, at some point you kind of have to ask, who am I? What is my priority? What is my primary love? And the complicator for each one of us is that it is easier to ask and answer that question in the abstract than in the concrete.
That's right.
Okay, so all right, that was a good segue into the part of this discussion that gets really very thorny, as far as the sort of the walking wounded, the people who are moving on from church because of some degree of pain or abuse. What did you discover about this 10 million?
Yeah, so let me speak more specifically than just even the sum total of the 10 million people who left. So of that 40 million, that's all religious traditions. Now, roughly 95% of all religious traditions in this country are of some sort of Christian variety. So, about, a little under 20 million of the people who left were leaving mainline or Roman Catholic contexts. And then the other 15 were leaving evangelical contexts. So let me zoom in, because I can speak with the greatest statistical significance and greater granularity of what's going on among dechurched casualties within the evangelical dechurch. So we're talking 15 million people who left evangelical churches. In the book, we outline 4 different types of evangelicals. So, and those were developed by basically Ryan used his machine learning algorithm to basically go over the data so that we can not introduce like our own biases in terms of how to lump, how to lump groups of people together. So then we can have statistically significant groups of people who have statistically significant common answer choices for the most important questions pertaining to dechurching. Okay. So of those 4 profiles, I'm going to give you those super quick. We go in tremendous detail in the Great Dechurching book. But basically the first profile is cultural Christians. And I'm going to get to the exevangelicals in a second, but I think this context is important. The cultural Christians, about 8 million people. These are folks that probably never had a very deep understanding of the Christian faith, and probably were not Christian in the sense of, kind of the historic creeds and confessions of the faith, but were nominally, kind of connected to a local church for some period of their life. Then the second group, the second, third, and fourth groups are all between 2 and 2.5 million people. So the second group we called mainstream dechurched evangelicals. And these are people who definitely seem to be Christian. They have a deep understanding of the gospel. They're still actively practicing their faith, but just not going to church at all. And so this group of people left roughly in about 3 years ago, around 2020 is kind of where the bell curve is for that group of people. The third group, which I'm going to come back to, that's the exevangelicals. Again, 2.5 million people. And then the fourth group was the BIPOC group. That stands for, that's a technical term for Black, Indigenous persons or persons of color. So we didn't allow the machine learning algorithm to sort based on race or ethnicity. So when that algorithm was sorting people by their common answer choices, it did not have the ability to see race or ethnicity. So the cultural Christians were 97% white, maybe not. Yeah, the mainstream were 91% white. Ex-evangelicals were 82% white, and then the BIPOC group were 0% white.
Right.
So it was interesting that even though Ryan calls this a shadow in the data. So even though the algorithm couldn't see ethnicity or race, it's still largely sorted based on that, because people of common ethnicity tended to have more similar reasons for why they left, when they left, and what their kind of underlying beliefs were. So that was really interesting. So that group, they left around the late 1990s, but that group was the highest income, highest education of the four groups, and they were 68% male and 76% African American. So you're talking about somewhere between 1 and 1.2 million African American men who are extremely upwardly mobile. We're talking mid six-figure average incomes. So a really interesting group of people that left in the kind of the Promise Keepers era of evangelicalism. But so those first two profiles, the cultural Christians and mainstream group, they look very casual in their departures. The BIPOC group has a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B in terms of casual versus dechurch casualty. And then to answer your actual question about the ex-evangelicals, that's the third group that we looked at. And so this is about just shy of 2.5 million people. Okay, and the reason why we chose the term ex-evangelical to describe this group is 0% of this group was willing to return to an evangelical church. Now, on the whole, zero. Okay.
Wow. Okay.
And you can see why the algorithm put this whole group of people together. Okay. But on the whole, of those 15 million people who left evangelical churches, 51% said that they're willing to return to a church today. So that's 47% of the cultural Christians, 100% of the mainstream Christians, 0% of the ex-evangelicals, and I believe 67% of the BIPOC group. Okay. So that's why we called this group ex-evangelical, is because they were done with evangelicalism. Now, 79% of this group were still willing to go to a Christian church of some sort that was outside of the evangelical tradition. So that was interesting. And further, this group had the second highest orthodoxy score of all the different groups. 97% of them said Jesus is the Son of God. So by comparison, the mainstream group, 98% said Jesus is the Son of God. The cultural Christian group said only 1% of them said Jesus is the Son of God. Okay. And 12% of the BIPOC group on Jesus is the Son of God. So this group, there's a lot of Christianity that's still there. I would say for probably about 3/4 of them, Nicene Creed level, like Christianity on, the Trinity, the hypostatic union of Jesus, the sinlessness of Jesus, penal substitutionary atonement, the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, and the reliability of the Bible. Their average score was 70% on those, seven areas. Compare that with, 86% for people who still go to church and 87% from the mainstream dechurch. So there's a lot of Christianity that's still there in the mix. And when you consider that 21% of that group are just totally done with, any faith whatsoever, and you kind of pull that 21% of those ex-evangelicals out who have not just deconstructed but deconverted, there's a lot of faith that's still there in that group. So here's a couple things that I think people need to understand about I am actively trying to broaden the definition of an exevangelical. Okay, not with nefarious motive, but what
Right.
I'm trying to say is I think that there are two large, big groups of evangelicals. Okay, you could argue there were three. The group that we're most familiar with are people who are hyper online, in trend a little bit younger, and who are kind of processing out loud, not just the disenculturation from evangelical subculture, but oftentimes also deconstruction, taking key doctrines and historic doctrines and leaving those behind, all the way up through and including deconversion at points. Okay, so that's one group where it's not just, it's disenculturation, deconstruction, and deconversion. Okay, then I think you have another group who is largely disenculturating or disentangling. And the difference there is the key doctrines are probably either largely still intact or entirely still intact. And the process that's going on there is a crisis of faith that has to do with sorting out the difference between, the triune God of the Bible and evangelical subculture. And where does one start and stop and the other begin, and just kind of sorting out and disenculturating, removing all the subcultural elements while still maintaining, like, Jesus, the Trinity,
Right.
the gospel, the kingdom of God, the faith once delivered to the saints.
Yeah, this is what I've talked about as disentangling Christendom and Christianity.
Correct.
Christendom, the institutions, the churches, the schools, the everything, and then Christianity, the faith. What is the authentic faith versus how is it manifested in these institutions? That's probably the subculture I'm most familiar with because of the work that Nancy and my wife and I have done on, for example, the Kanakuk camps or the examination of liberty or Ravi Zachariah. I mean, you could just go the SBC. Yep. Those are the individuals I have disproportionately interacted with who would agree with the Apostles' Creed, who believe in inerrancy and look at all of this, and they're just, I guess the proper term is gobsmacked and deeply distrustful, is sort of that community I'm most familiar with.
Yeah, I have a lot of familiarity with those same circles, too. That's I grew up in a very large, evangelical tradition, where I was in church 3 times a week, and I didn't understand the gospel for over 14 years because it really wasn't preached to me.
Oh,
it was, humans and dinosaurs living together. It was the end times charts. It was, and the most important things were behavioral in terms of, don't drink, don't smoke, don't cuss, don't hang around people that do, vote this way, not that way, those different kinds of things. So, in terms of disenculturation, well, that's a process I'm very familiar with because, that's something that I had to do, of just knowing the difference between, God's word and what is all the various different onion layers of subculture that's there. But who else has the words of life? I will say this though about, and this is probably the most important thing I can say about ex-evangelicals. On the whole, they were the oldest of the groups. They were the least online of the groups, and America was working most poorly for them. The average ex-evangelical in our data is a woman who is 53 years old, who America has fundamentally and foundationally not worked for her. She has below average education. She has below average income. She hardly spends any time on the internet, and she probably works more than one job, and she probably is not inside of a nuclear family. Probably didn't come from a nuclear family, probably doesn't have one. And so that person is someone I think that is very, very important. If you're listening to this and you're a minister or you're on staff with a church, you're a pastor, you're clergy, or you're just somebody who, goes to church and, takes the gospel seriously, I want you to think about this person in your community, because she has been forgotten about. And there's places where, she's willing to go, but she's going to need, a lot of time and effort, to care for her, because there's significant pain that's there. 58% of the ex-evangelicals are self-identify as independent politically. They've been left behind by, it's
everything.
Like, that's like 4 to 6 times any of the other groups in terms of the rate of, people who self-identify as independent. Now, policy-wise, it's center to center left. But, it's just indicative of, a group of, the church is just one more institution that has failed, this group of people that have been largely forgotten about in American public life, And just anecdotally, well, not anecdotally, I mean, there's a disproportionate number of people in the Midwest who fit the ex-evangelical profile. And I think there's a lot of things that, that we could say, about that, and some of that with more veracity than others in terms of, our hunches as to what's going on there.
Right. It's interesting. This profile also seems to fit with what we've seen, because you're talking about people who've been left behind in the United States, that we do have this incredible break that is existing between college-educated Americans and working-class Americans. On church affiliation, it's lower for working-class Americans. On life expectancy, it's lower for working-class Americans. Civic connections, in other words, what kind of civic organizations including, but also aside from church that you're affiliated with, is lower with working-class Americans. Friendships. It really is this extraordinary divide in the United States between, it's almost, we overuse the phrase two Americas to describe the red and blue and religious and secular, etc. But there are some really stark differences between college educated and working class Americans that dovetail exactly with the work you're talking about.
Marriage is also a huge factor. I don't know, if you've been reading this stuff that Institute for Family Studies and Brad Wilcox and others, and there's been I think an uptick in just kind of looking at marriage, because there's just huge differences between those who are college educated and those who aren't on marriage, and those that are kind of the nuclear family benefit versus not having those things. There's just significant differences on that. In addition to that, I think it was the American Enterprise Institute that had the success sequence, where 97% of millennials who graduated high school, got married, and had children after they got married, 97% live above the poverty line in America. And this is something that Ryan talked extensively with Jim and I, and really wanted to drill in our heads, is America works well if you kind of follow that success sequence.
Yes.
But if you get off that path, it can be a difficult and even harsh place to, its institutions, the ladders of society, and these different kinds of things, they just don't tend to work very well for you. And so I think there are lessons here, for us. And it doesn't matter whether you're in flyover country or whether you're, a kind of coastal elite or whatever.
Right.
I mean, I think there's lessons for all of us of just, there's no mere mortals. Everybody that we're interacting with is an image bearer with the same inherent dignity, imbued by, our triune creator God. And we can't forget anybody. And so, and it's clear that just, church has become a middle class and upper middle class phenomenon That's where once you get in the upper class or lower middle class and below, that's where things really start to drop off on either ends. But more on the lower, basically working class and below is where things really start to erode. And
yeah, it's really interesting and counterintuitive to a lot of people who look at college as the big threat to faith, that it's college educated people who more frequently go to church. And it's been, as Ryan has pointed out in a number of posts, it's been that way for generations.
Try this stat on for size. I mean, this was perhaps certainly top 5 most shocking, things that we, came across. Only 3% of evangelicals who got graduate degrees dechurched.
Huh.
That is 1/8 the rate of dechurching among evangelicals on the whole, and 1/12 the rate of dechurching of those who had only a high school diploma or less. Gosh. So, secular. Now, what's interesting there is that people are most likely to dechurch in that 18 to 30 time frame, but it doesn't appear to be the root cause there. Just because, we got to be mindful of the correlation causation thing. It does not appear to be because of education / secular education. So that was something that was really, really interesting to us. And hopefully if you're a college minister or, somebody who's connected, and near a university, it should give you hope in terms of making investments in students. We should be doubling down on student ministry in general, because this is a vulnerable time, but it doesn't appear to be vulnerable because of the educational process itself.
So in the remaining amount of time, and by the way, I just want to urge people who are listening, buy the book. One of the things when I was promoting my most recent book, Michael, I was constantly having these long podcast conversations about the book. And, it's interesting. I got messages from people saying, I don't even feel like I need to read it. I feel like I got all of the gist of everything. Not the case. You cannot actually fully understand a book in all its dimensions in a brief conversation like this. So please get the book. But let's move to the last part of this, which is to remedies. I want to see more people feeling at home in church. I want to see more people feeling, I want to see people ordering towards the highest, the most transcendent goods, and away from the lesser goods, as wonderful as winning a volleyball tournament is, or whatever. I want people ordered towards the transcendent good. But everything that you're describing here doesn't sound amenable to simple solutions. So, people will say, well, if you just preach that old time religion, people will come flocking. Well, maybe sometimes, I don't know, but it sounds like what is needed is a lot of affirmative reach out to individual human beings by people in church. When I was, I spent a couple of years or about a year and a half as an interim youth pastor years ago, when a youth pastor had to leave because he was caught online doing things that he shouldn't do. So I stepped in, and one of the things that we did when kids were falling away from the youth group and it just drifted is we would literally just go to their house and pick them up. Like, hey, where's, we called our car the Soul Repo van. And we would go out and to people, and it's not that they had said a pox on your house about the youth group. It was this drifting phenomenon. And sort of we knew who might be upset at someone in the youth group and might be wanting to leave because of that. And that's one thing you dealt with. But another thing entirely to deal with when somebody was drifting. And in many ways, that was the most difficult thing to do. You could talk about repentance and reconciliation between people who had harmed each other individually. It was, in my experience, a lot harder to break through when somebody was in that drift mode. And I don't know if that's been your experience. I mean, you've got years of experience pastoring, but none of this strikes me as easy. None of this strikes me as formulaic.
Yeah. So in the interest of, on the one hand, there might not be formulas here. And I think, and the more granular you get, you can get as much complexity as you want.
For sure.
That's there. In some ways, though, I just want to zoom out and make something that's abstract and complex simple and concrete. And so I think on the whole, you're talking about issues that pertain to really two things: individuals and institutions. And both of them can make improvements. So in the middle of all this bad news, Jim and I and Ryan came out of it with way more good news and way more hope than what we expected. Because, over half the people who left are willing to return right now. Even people, 67% of the BIPOC group. These folks have not been to church at all since the late 1990s. You're willing to go to church right now? Really? But yeah, that's what they said, totally anonymous survey, nothing to gain from saying otherwise. So, we had a lot of hope in all of that. And we kind of had people largely in three different buckets in terms of how we, kind of thought of them. There's one group that they just seem to need a nudge. And this would be kind of that mainstream group. They miss church. They want to be back at church. They don't have good reasons for why they see themselves being there in the long term. They just got out of the habit. Okay. Well, that person will come back to church if you send them a text, have a water cooler moment, call them on the phone, or, hey, when can I pick you up? Can we do barbecue after? They will say yes. Just anecdotally, every time we've identified somebody that fits this profile, 100% of the time they have said yes, that they're, willing to return. The second group of people, they need to be at our dinner table. And I think that's kind of the cultural Christians, the BIPOC group, largely are in that kind of dinner table, level of relational intimacy, where there needs to be some trust that's there. There needs to be some understanding. There needs to be some ability to have, kind of back and forth dialogue, pushback. We need to be able to hear hard things, from some of those conversations as well. And, validate things that aren't the way that they should be, in some of those instances. The third group of people are probably never going to return to an evangelical church, but maybe they'd be willing to, go to a different tradition. And some are just never gonna go anywhere. They've just been so hurt. Look, I know people who have psychosomatic responses to just being geographically proximate to a church, that their body physically, starts to, exhibit physiological responses to those things. I understand that there are people who have stories that are so horrible that that's what occurs to them, when they have those things. So that's not the person who needs a nudge. It's not the person that that only needs your dinner table. You got to be in their lives for a long time, and you got to have no expectations kind of placed on them. But again, those are probably the further you get out in terms of more edge cases. I think when we went into this process, I think just because of our own information diet, we kind of felt like our assumption was if you had a conversation with somebody that kind of involved either spiritual things or, even inviting somebody to church, we thought that was going to be a potentially relationship ending conversation. And I think the most encouraging thing about all of this research is that it looks like in nearly all instances, and certainly most instances, it's not a relationship ending conversation. And if it's a relationship ending conversation, you're going to know if it's going to be a relationship ending conversation because if you embody any relational wisdom and, you're going to be able to, kind of read the room, on stuff like that. And so, one of the things that Jim and I have gone and just kind of asked people, if you just kind of go back in your mind and you eliminate baby showers and weddings and birthdays, when was the last time anybody invited you to something?
Oh yeah.
And how did it make you feel to be asked for your presence at something? I think, when you kind of zoom out and you just kind of demystify some of these things, I think that most people want to be wanted, and that they appreciate that you want their presence at something. And, even though, I've read all the, various articles about, negative world and neutral world and positive world and all that stuff. I still think that there's, people want to be wanted, and they like to be invited to things. And, when I talk, I'm in a community that's only 3 or 4 years old in terms of when the neighborhood was built. And the interesting thing about that, in a city like Orlando, I think the third fastest growing city in the country, everybody's from somewhere else. And, our families were transracially adoptive parents. So, our family is not like a nuclear entire, white family. Our children are African American. There isn't like a single nuclear, like, totally Caucasian family in a five house radius in a relatively upwardly mobile community. And so, but like when I talk to, to these people, people who are probably above average secular, there's not huge aversion to the kind of Christianity that, the kind of historic Reformed Protestant Christianity that I would be an adherent to. So I think that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit here for us if we can get over demystify what's going on and get over some of our fears of what some of these things, might mean. Now, you shouldn't just invite people to church and and be on the no plan in terms of, what to do about that, and
no plan.
I mean, that's the plan that most people are on, is the no plan. It's the most common plan there is.
Yeah.
So that's on the individual front. On the institutional front, Jim and I built an entire website and a whole other resource beyond the book, The Great Dechurching. Okay. So I've hardly even talked about this anywhere. But we built a website called, this is really hard to remember. It's dechurching.com.
Ooh.
So we made dechurching.com, and we built it for local churches and as an institutional resource. So on that website, you can find for totally free a 20-point audit for areas that pertain to a local church and how you're structured and how you do ministry that impact deeply the subject of dechurching. So in that audit, there's 3 categories: things that will help your church kind of close the back door, things that will help your church open the front door, and things that will help send out the people in your church body better equipped. So there's a paid resource there, that has like worksheets for each of those 20 areas, on there. Yeah. But the audits, available, for free. And so we wanted to create a resource, because The Great Dechurching as a book is most centered around helping individuals. And that's, in terms of, doing better on this subject. Certainly there's plenty there, as well for clergy and, for church staffs and those different kinds of things, elder boards. But we wanted to create just a purely institutional resource there that kind of, depending on your polity, whether it's, session, diaconate, elder board, vestry, that they would have everything that they need to kind of go through a checklist of, okay, how we're doing on, various subjects that we know empirically impact, in terms of how a church is structured, impact this kind of dechurching phenomenon. So that's why we created that resource there on dechurching.com, and you can do that audit, among your church leaders.
That's fantastic. Yeah, it just strikes me, and I really appreciate all the time you've given us, that there's also just no substitute for emotional intelligence, wisdom, compassion, empathy. There are people who you're going to encounter in your life who are the casuals that you've talked about, that just the simple act of caring enough about them to ask them to come with you to something is a relational gift, in addition to pulling them hopefully back into a community of transcendent meaning and purpose. And then there are people who have been through hell, for lack of a better term, and you don't just sort of casually go, hey, we've got a potluck, come, you have to dig in, and you really do have to work through things like, how do you rejoin a community writ large that has inflicted so much pain? How do you deal with the absence of justice? This is one thing that, as my wife and I have talked to and interacted with people who have been actually victimized in some of the most awful ways in church communities. There's this crying out for justice, and the absence of it just creates this sort of gaping wound. And that in many ways is one of the hardest things to deal with when, for example, you're interacting with these individuals and you don't have the capacity or ability to bring them justice.
Yeah.
So treating people as individuals rather than sort of plug and play versions of a formula, there's just no substitute for it. I think that's one of my big takeaways from your research is, there are these big categories. Absolutely. But within every category is a story.
That's right. Yeah.
Knowing people's stories is just of critical importance.
So much just comes down to just relational wisdom.
Yeah.
And are we people who deal equitably and fairly? And in other words, how do we steward other people's stories?
Yeah.
And how do we steward the intimacy, whatever level of intimacy that somebody is willing to share with us? I mean, that's, in a society where relational intimacy is eroding and everybody is sorting themselves into smaller and smaller concentric circles, almost down in, turned inside, almost into our own self. When people are willing to share parts of their lives with us, how we steward that intimacy that they're willing to share with us is very, very important. And we need to be shepherding that towards to dealing with that with things that create trust and not dissolve it. And, from the institutional standpoint, look, we have a gospel that is true, good, and beautiful all at the same time. But we found ourselves in various fractured traditions that will either focus on truth or focus on goodness or focus on beauty, oftentimes at the expense of one or the other two. And I think one of the things that many of us miss about Tim Keller was his ability to have all three of those things, not just in himself as a person, but in the institutions with which, he, founded and partnered with. And I think, just having that balance between the head and the heart and the hands, all three of these things, if we're going to have any form of effective witness in the 21st century, we live in an age of anxiety and cynicism. People will not believe us unless we have all three of those things moving in parallel and in tandem with each other. And and I think in many ways they're right to want to demand that of us. More often than not, I find that the objections that people have to Christianity today is that our Christianity is not Christian enough.
Yeah.
And so we must fight to and work to have a healthy and robust gospel, and that we follow the full counsel of the Word of God in all things. And I think when we do, I think we have everything in the world to offer. I mean, I think in some ways, David, and this is where I would push back at some of the things that have been published here in the last year or two, is I think gospel ministry is actually getting easier
Mm,
because the more people have caricatures of what Christianity actually is, it becomes less difficult for us to surprise them with with an authentic, true, good, and beautiful gospel.
yeah.
And so the more absurd and does not correlate to reality, the picture becomes, the easier things become for us to be really surprising to people and infectious. And look, I've been watching all this stuff, yeah, maybe this will, betray when this is recorded, with I've been watching this stuff with Hamas and in Israel, and it's been interesting for me to watch the horseshoe of anti-Semitism.
Yes. Uh-huh.
And I think the anti-Semitism that comes from the kind of hard right has been readily available for everybody to see for a long time. But I think what has maybe been a little bit more hidden in plain sight has been the anti-Semitism, from the left, where there's significant, in certain corners, significant solidarity with you know
With Hamas.
with
Yeah.
Hamas, and
Mhm.
it's these are problematic things, and it's like I think that we're in an age where power on either end of the spectrum is all people care about anymore, and it's nihilism. It doesn't, it's just pure raw Nietzschean will to power, that people are willing to do anything to have their particular political vision become a reality in the world in hope for its, illusory utopian vision, and or whatever the vision of virtue, whatever it is. And I think what but Christianity has the antidote for either of the any horseshoe
Yeah.
that you look at. You're not going to find any virtue or any health on either ends of that horseshoe. And so I think we live actually in remarkably easy times in terms of the worse, the internet and the web 2 and social age and everything kind of fractures us, turns us inward, hyper individualism, expressive individualism, all that kind of stuff. All of that is unlivable. It's all unlivable in what we need, and it's all anti-institutional as well.
Hmm.
We need to be doubling down in an anxious and anti-institutional age. We must be doubling down on healthy institutions. Now, that means repentance, reform, and renewal, where
Sure.
repentance, reform, and renewal are needed, in our institutions. But we need embodied interactions with other people. I have an elder here at our church who always tells our elder board, he says, guys, the ability to handle dissonance is a sign of relational and spiritual maturity. The ability to handle dissonance is a sign of relational and spiritual maturity. Well, that's the benefit of institutions, is you get real world embodied interaction with people who you disagree with. And you
Hmm.
know what? You get better for it because you're able to see from multiple different perspectives. You can become more persuasive, even if you're not convinced of those different perspectives. At the minimum, you have the benefit of increased understanding. You have the
Yep.
benefit of being
Singing my song, Michael.
yeah,
Singing my song.
you have the benefit of being in a relationship with
Yep.
other people, and it's great. And this is
Hmm.
where unity and diversity are both good things, and you need to. So I worry, and we become more resilient people the more dissonance that we have in our lives. And so
Yeah.
it's good for us to have these things, and it's okay to disagree with people, and
Yeah.
you can do so in a way that's calm and non-anxious, and your whole person doesn't have to be, in your sense of meaning and purpose and identity, these things don't have to be threatened,
Yeah.
because you can be secure in those things.
Yeah.
Anyways.
Well, yeah. No, I'm so with you on this. And the one thing that I have seen is far from this, as you were saying, this being a world that's extremely resistant to sort of gospel living. When you walk into an anxious, divided, angry world and you approach it with humility and kindness and confidence in where your hope lies, it's you can sometimes almost see people physically respond, like
That's right.
physically relax, physically move towards this manifestation of peace and kindness and patience, and it's like a coming across a it's coming across an oasis in a desert. And so yeah, I just do not buy that this time is particularly resistant to Christianity. I think in many ways is particularly hungry for it.
That's right.
So
Well,
anyway, well, go ahead. What?
Anxiety is contagious, and
Yeah.
individual anxiety is contagious, but institutions can also be
Mm-hmm.
anxious. Okay,
Yeah.
and so we need non-anxious institutions as much as we need non-anxious individuals. I can think of whole ministries where probably the primary fruit, when you really boil down the essence of that particular ministry, the primary fruit is anxiety. Well, this is problematic, because one of the things that Jim and I learned during kind of the pandemic in particular, and really post 2016, was you can't pastor people who are emotionally dysregulated. In other words, so what happens just from a basic neurobiology is your reasoning occurs in your prefrontal cortex, in the front of your skull. And what happens when people get emotionally dysregulated is the prefrontal cortex, where all that reasoning occurs, it gets bypassed, and people they live out of what's known as the amygdala. Well, the amygdala is what puts you in that fight, flight, or freeze kind of dilemma, and you don't have the ability to have your reasoning faculties, and you're not in a position where you can be persuaded. So we found, in order for us to preach and teach effectively, we had to pre-pastor people and get them in a place where they are calm and non-anxious. You can only pastor and teach and preach to people who are in a place where they're calm and where their prefrontal cortex and their reasoning faculties are intact, so that they can actually be persuaded. So I think sometimes we have to do the work of pre-persuasion to get people in a place where they can be calm enough in their spirit. And we all know this. If you got kids, an escalated parent cannot de-escalate an escalated child. Okay.
True.
And this, it's true in parenting, and it's true on the internet.
Yeah.
And it's true in pastoring. You have to be, you have to be de-escalated and in the pocket emotionally in order to help other people. And, and I think about, Tim Keller was, and John Stott were I think the emissaries of this, New York City, London, some of the most secular cities, some of the most multicultural cities in the world, highly effective ministries, institutions, will be going for, decades and decades, perhaps longer, and both very calm, non-anxious people. And when you're that mediating presence for other people, and when you're the one person who's not, who doesn't have worry and concern, and whenever in a very anxious age, gosh, that's contagious.
Yeah, it really is. And that's a great note to end on. So Michael, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your work on the book. Incredibly insightful, incredibly counterintuitive to multiple kind of narratives, and provides a real roadmap, not an easy one, but a meaningful roadmap for for addressing an anxious age. So thank you very much.
Thank you, David. It was awesome to be here.